Good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Ann Wilson, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us on this webinar where we're celebrating Data Protection Day. I have an excellent panel here, and we have a very interesting topic to discuss. But before I introduce my panel and tell you more about that topic, let's talk a little bit about Data Protection Day. What is Data Protection Day? Well, on April 26, 2006, the Council of Europe decided that they were going to say January 28th is now going to be known as Data Protection Day. But why January 28th? Because that is the date that the Council of Europe's Data Protection Convention, also known as Convention 108, was opened for signature. So between January 28, 2007 and now, that makes this the 17th global observation of Data Protection Day. And on that day, governments and other organizations like TTEC hold events where they educate persons about the data protection laws in their territories. Jamaica enacted its own data privacy laws with the passing of the Data Protection Act in June 2020, and we appointed our own information commissioner on December the 1st, 2021. Her name is Celia Barkley. Today, we are going to be talking about a specific section of the Data Protection Act, the one that relates to the technical controls that companies need to have in place to protect their information systems. With us to discuss these controls, we have Jaleel Henry, who is a security specialist at TTEC. Beside him, we have Krishna Singh, who is the CIO, Chief Information Officer at Mayberry. Beside him, we have Chuck Cameron, who is lead practitioner at Design Privacy, who is also a TTEC partner. And on the end, we have Omar Bell, who is Grace Kennedy's IT operations manager. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today.
Morning.
Morning, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
To get us started with our discussions today, I'm going to ask Chuck, where are we with the Data Protection Act right now? Have the deadlines changed? Is everything the same? Has the Information Commissioner said or done anything? What's going on?
So what the legislation said is that we have 2 years to become compliant with the Data Protection Act. And that was said on December 1, 2020. Therefore, is that correct? So therefore,
21.
21. Therefore, we have about 10 months and let's say 9 days before we have to become compliant.
Wow.
And that means we should all be in a position to register, and we should have implemented all the privacy frameworks and technology solutions that are, to some extent, prescribed by the Data Protection Act.
Wow, okay. That's not a lot of time at all, Chuck.
It really, both in Europe and across the world, we usually have a 2-year transition period to implement all of these controls that we'll be discussing today. So if we have not finished the first phase in terms of putting our house in a position to register with the Information Commissioner, we're significantly behind the 8 ball, and we have noticed that a lot of people are now trying to start the exercise, but 10 months is not a lot of time, and you need to be super focused if there's any hope of being compliant within the next 10 months.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Chuck. As you said, this is it's new to us here, and the measures, they are new. With us today, as mentioned, are two gentlemen whose organizations have actually started getting prepared for being compliant with the Data Protection Act. Krishna, Omar, how has it been? How has the journey been? And where are you guys with the process now?
At Mayberry, we're pretty far advanced in our data compliance journey. We've been working closely with Chuck at Design Privacy and TTEC as well to put the operational and technical measures in place to have our compliance in order. We've been looking at things like vulnerability scanning and encryption from the technical side, and there's also a very what I call an administrative side of it, procedures, policies, so forth to put in place, which I believe companies like Mayberry, we draw on the expertise of our partners to get this done. And I would say we are pretty well advanced, and we are very much on track to be fully compliant by the prescribed date.
I think we have made similar progress to to Krishna and Mayberry. We have spent a lot of time trying to understand the requirements. Fortunately, we did make a lot of progress before in terms of putting things in place, because we did have some previous requirements that we needed to be compliant for, and they kind of coincide with the General Data Protection Act technical requirements. We are now working on implementing the measures during the process checks and working our way through compliance.
Okay, thank you. So the Data Protection Act has 8 standards for data controllers and companies to follow in order to be compliant. And today we are focusing on the 7th standard, which is talking all about the technical measures. Jalil, can you tell us what some of those technical measures are?
Sure, Leslie. So some of those technical measures are data encryption, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, data backup and recovery. Those are the most critical ones.
Well, that's quite a list. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What do you mean by encryption?
Sure. So encryption is encrypting data at rest and data in transit.
Okay.
Secondly, there is vulnerability assessments. Vulnerability assessments is basically you capturing all the vulnerabilities within a network and remediating them.
Okay, all right.
Thirdly, there is penetration testing. So this is us as a security professional going into assessing a web application or a website or anything like that, poking holes in it, looking for vulnerabilities that may exist and remediating them.
Okay.
Lastly, there is data backup and recovery. So this is basically making sure that there's a backup of the data that is present within the organization and that we can go ahead and recover in the event that there's a disaster.
Okay, that sounds like a comprehensive list. Chuck, are those the only mandatory measures that need to be implemented, or are there any additional mandatory measures?
From a technical measures perspective, those would represent the majority of them. And when we say mandatory, the legislation actually either speaks explicitly or implicit to these technical measures. So from an IT perspective, I heard the word critical used. It's not a question of being critical. In Section 30 of the Data Protection Act, it says you must do things. The only other one that was not addressed is the whole question of pseudonymization. And it's a question as to whether or not you could have encryption or pseudonymization or encryption and pseudonymization.
Okay.
So let me break down what pseudonymization
I was
is.
about to ask.
So the concept behind the Data Protection Act is protecting information about your clients, your customers, your employees, and you must use all measures available to do so. One such measure is pseudonymization. So even if an employee has access to a database with customer data, if the employee doesn't need to know the name of the client, but for example needs to know a service number associated with the client, that is how your information should be structured. If you have a CRM or customer relationship management system, you don't need to see Chuck Cameron and the conversation that was had with Chuck Cameron. You just need to see client number 1. The system should be able to marry those two together for those persons who need to know who client number 1 is. So that's the concept behind pseudonymization, replacing an identifier for an individual data item.
So Jalil, you mentioned a technical risk assessment. Are there other controls that may come out of that technical risk assessment that people might want to implement?
There are a few others. One of them is asset management. Asset management is basically your organization taking account of their stock, the assets that they may have within the organization, and basically that helps them to make decisions going forward. Another one is EDR slash SOC. So EDR is basically a beefed up antivirus in a sense, where the agent is installed on the different endpoints and it analyzes those endpoints, looking for any malware that may exist or any malicious activity that's going on within the endpoint. So behind the EDR component, there's a human element, which is the SOC. So the SOC then goes ahead and looks at those threats that is highlighted by the EDR agent, and then goes through it and remediates any incidents that might pop up.
Okay, and when you say SOC, you mean Security
Operations Center.
Okay,
That's correct.
perfect.
So lastly, there's a last one, which is MFA. So MFA is multi-factor authentication. It comes in 3 flavors: something you have, something you are, and something you do. So to break them down, something you have is your iris, FaceTime or Face ID or anything like that.
Okay.
Your fingerprint ID, something you do, which might be your PIN that you type in,
Okay.
and something you
Have?
which is your PIN.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that, Jalil. That is quite a list of measures that companies will have to have in place.
So I'd like to jump in on this question or concept of a risk assessment. So it is understood that one size will not fit all data controllers. And the legislation actually contemplates that. It does require that all organizations look at the type of data they are processing, the available technical state of art that's available. They look at the risk associated with how they are processing that data. And then you do a risk assessment of that, taking those things into consideration. So part of compliance is demonstrating that you have considered all of those variables and then identify the suitable controls that would specifically remediate the threats that are within your organization, and based on your budget, implement the controls that fit you. So risk assessment isn't only a technical term of art. To be compliant, you have to demonstrate that you have taken all of those things into consideration.
So you would have to have completed this risk assessment and also started, implementing the measures, or have a plan for implementation.
Suffice it to say, given the limited period of time, even over the 2 years, all data controllers at this stage should have, at a bare minimum, completed their risk assessments, if not, and have a plan and identified what controls need to be implemented flowing from the risk assessment.
Okay, thank you for that. So as you are a practitioner out there working with different organizations, do you think they're taking it seriously? Do you think we're taking it seriously?
So there is no economic incentive for companies to place heavy emphasis on your name and my name. What is really driving the companies that have started are those companies who are highly regulated, understand the concept of regulation, and more importantly, have relationships overseas, where overseas companies and overseas countries are saying, you must demonstrate to us that you have a robust data protection framework in place. We are seeing a gradual uptick in awareness of companies through work such as TTEC, in terms of sensitizing and making the public aware at large. And as we get closer to that deadline, we are seeing a significant uptick. But in the absence of those laws being implemented, we would see it happening at a very gradual pace until then.
Okay. I really hope that people are listening and paying attention and realizing that this is really serious and you need to get started on the process. Chuck mentioned that the organizations that are more familiar with heavy regulations are the ones that have started the process and have made their way. And in fact, you gentlemen should be familiar, you work in highly regulated industries. What do you think some of the consequences are with, not being compliant? Omar?
I think the reputational risk is one that we are particularly concerned about. In order to do business with external partners these days, there are a lot of additional requirements, environmental and social type governance initiatives and data privacy as well. So, just to get to the table to to have some conversations with some organizations, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done, enough work in these areas to actually have a proper conversation and start doing business with them.
Right.
And to add to that too, there's also the obvious legal fines and penalties associated with not being compliant with the Data Protection Act. And this is something that can significantly affect a company's operation because some of these penalties are very steep. So it is a major risk not to achieve the compliance. But to add to that, Leslie, I would say that there is also the data breach aspect of a data breach for people who are not compliant. So loss of a client data ties back into what Omar said. That's loss of a company's reputation right there. And in this day and age, it's a steep price to pay.
Yeah, it is. Chuck, are there any other penalties that maybe you could, mention that maybe haven't been considered or stated?
Yes, the Information Commissioner has the ability to tell you to lock down your business until you have implemented the controls. Full stop.
That's pretty steep.
There is no higher price to pay. So forget about going to jail. Forget about paying the whole heap of money. If it is, she has formed the view that you have not implemented the appropriate data controls, she has the ability to say, stop processing personal data until you have implemented the appropriate controls. And if you think about it, when she says stop processing personal data, that means you can't process a credit card or a debit card. That means you can't access a customer record. That means you can't do business. She does not need to go to court to get a court order to do this. This is her initiative, her assessment. So that is something that I find is not really discussed. People pay attention to the fines and the reputation. She can tell you to lock down your business until you put the things in order.
Wow. All right. So, as you gentlemen have already started the process of becoming compliant, what are some of the challenges that you guys have faced? Because I can't imagine that this was a bed of roses to get to where you are today.
Right. I'd say the biggest challenge we've seen from our end is just understanding these terms. I mean, this is a new concept to us. They're words that we're familiar with, the data controller, pseudonymization. I mean, that's a word we're actually not very familiar with, but it's a term that we've had to learn and, we've had to seek the relevant or the relevance of these terms as it relates to the Data Protection Act. So for us, it's an internal learning experience of what these terms are. How are we to enforce these measures to be compliant and, not be in any form of breach or lack thereof. And the second largest challenge, I would say, is the actual processes that need to be in place. Now, it is separate from being technical. This is just each organization needs to have certain policies and procedures in place, or at least recommended to have them in place. So for us, we work closely again, with our technical partners here to have this done and just have everything put in place.
Yeah, I agree completely with Krishna. For us, just to add to that, I'd say explaining to the staff how they need to operate going forward, with these new regulations. We had partnered with TTEC before to do security awareness training for our staff, and we expanded that relationship to include data privacy training as well. And so far, we've done at least one successful campaign of training, but it's challenging because now you've given the employees another thing to do. There's more things, more training, and we do understand that that can be tedious and challenging for them, but it's something that we need to do in order to ensure that we meet our objectives.
Question, is it really the staff you have a challenge with? Because once you tell staff to do something, they need to do it. Our experience is really the executive level and the board level that really have to understand the issues and buy into the issues. And once it flows from there, we have found that the implementation is that much easier But with it, if the executive, the leadership of the organizations don't understand the requirements or the imperative to get it done, we have found that that is a greater challenge.
Well, I think we've been a little fortunate because we did get executive buy-in and early, in terms of ensuring that these initiatives have been in place. And they have been pushing senior management to get this done as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. Again, for them, it is also another thing to do in terms of, and if you think about it, the executive leadership, these are all very busy people on other boards, so again, it is a little challenging, I will agree, but I think, as I said, we've been fortunate and we've had their full support so far.
Okay, but speaking of buy-in, how did the conversation about budget go? Was that something easy? Did you have any challenges with getting the appropriate budget for this kind of undertaking?
Well, as with any undertaking, there are budgetary challenges because, we work in a strict environment. So for us, the main thing is obviously understanding what it is we need to have in place first, where your partners come into place, then getting the relevant costing. And yes, budget approval is always a challenge, but again, you look at the risks of not doing it as well versus, the cost associated with getting it done. And from that point of view, and the fact that it is a legal requirement, it's something that we have to have in place. It's common or practical business sense to proceed with it.
Okay. Do you think that other organizations will have similar challenges? Do you think your challenges are unique, or do you think that these will go across industries and organizational sizes?
I really don't think they're unique. I expect all organizations, big and small, to have these very similar challenges.
Agreed.
In the implementation, budget, just the technical challenges, explaining it to the staff, managing the processes and understanding the processes. I don't expect much deviation.
So there another external challenge, not necessarily internal, is when a data controller decides that they now need to get it done, where do you find the expertise to help you? Because the reality is, this is a new paradigm, a new concept, a new legislation. So the skill sets available to help you, that is very, very limited right now. So companies do have to be mindful of that. And we also need to be mindful that we operate under the Data Protection Act and not the GDPR, which is a General Data Protection Regulation. So what we have found is that organizations who are anxious to get going and can afford external overseas consultants, they come and advise and give recommendations based on the GDPR. There are substantial differences between the GDPR and the Data Protection Act. So that's one thing. It is very critical to my mind that we understand. Yes, they do have some experience, like 2 years more experience, but one, you have to move fast. Local expertise is limited. And two, we operate under the Data Protection Act that is, while inspired by the GDPR, it is fundamentally different from the Data Protection Act, and they are not the same thing.
That's very important for people to remember and to bear in mind. Thank you for that. So we've been talking, in specifics, how your specific organizations have been doing. But let's zoom out a little bit. So on a more general sense, what are some of the behaviors and things that just happen that, we probably have become desensitized to or accustomed to that you learned through this process are breaches of the Data Protection Act?
Sure. I can give you an exact case in point. I went to, obviously I won't name the place, but I went to a customer service area. No, I will not joke. I went to a customer service section of a certain business the other day, and I was visibly on hold face-to-face as they spoke on the phone with the client. And the operator on the phone took down the information of the client, name, number, I guess to return the call and so on. But my eyes could easily look down on the paper and see the name of the person and the phone number. And for me, in the past, I wouldn't have thought twice of that. I grew up seeing that. That's normal. But from a context of a data protection, of the Data Protection Act and a data protection point of view, now in my mind, there was a red flag in my mind to say, look here, I am now seeing someone's data. I mean, if they look away, I could take my phone, take a snip of it or something if I would like to. So it has made me more aware of what we consider day-to-day things that are now breaches or potential breaches.
For me, as a people manager, I'm even more aware of handling my team members' data. Wasn't careless with it before, but just understanding the processes and understanding how that data moves through the organization. I'm a lot more aware and a little more careful with it because of this.
The two things that they make reference to does speak to a cultural shift that has to happen. What we heard Omar speaking about is the fact that he now realizes that he's a custodian of persons' personal data, and he needs to be mindful of how he treats with it. That needs to permeate throughout all organizations at every level. If it is, you can demonstrate that in writing, you are compliant.
In writing, okay. I think for me, one of the things that I started thinking about, similar to what you said, Krishna, of going somewhere and actually seeing the information written down. And there are several places that we have to go to that when you
Name
go,
them.
you're trying to get me in trouble, Chuck. I'm not naming anybody. But you have to go and you write down your name and your contact information and your email address, and it's in a big book, and you're looking at everybody else's information there. And I was uncomfortable before, but now I know, okay, this is a breach.
So what you want, the question is, what happens to that big book when it's full up?
There's no way to encrypt that book.
So, Chuck, fraud is a big topic right now. How can the Data Protection Act help organizations against fraud?
Well, firstly, implementing a data protection program doesn't prevent fraud or data breaches. Implementing a Data Protection Act allows you to comply with the Data Protection Act. So let me say that first clearly. However, in implementing some of the controls recommended by the Data Protection Act, it would mitigate, if not reduce, some of the threats like fraud, internal fraud, in that one of the basic requirements that best practice dictates is the implementation of access controls. As part of identifying your environment, you have to identify what personal data you're processing, and you need to identify why you are processing it. And having done that, you have to be able to say who needs to access that data and implement technical controls to ensure that only persons who need to access that data can access it. Once you have set up your access controls, you then now need to be looking at the monitoring who accesses the data. And it is not sufficient to put technical measures in place to say that you can monitor. You have to have someone assigned, like an information security officer, not your data protection officer, but someone with the responsibility of actually monitoring these logs. And in addition to doing that on an ongoing basis, it's now the responsibility of the board, who doesn't know, or the C-suite, who doesn't necessarily know anything about these details, to ensure that these systems and policies that have been implemented are audited. So the Data Protection Act is very policy-driven, is risk-driven. Fraud in any organization is a big risk. So firstly I said, if it is, you have not conducted that risk assessment, you would not have identified that fraud as a risk. If you did conduct that risk assessment, the standard controls to mitigate or remediate against fraud are very basic, and these are the basic requirements of implementing technical measures under the 7th standard.
All right, well, I think we had a good conversation today, good discussion. A lot of important points were raised and food for thought, I think, for everyone out there watching. Any last thoughts, gentlemen? Any last words? Ominous warnings? Anything?
I mean,
you
what
want
I
to
would say
share?
is the Data Protection Act is here. It's not an option. It's legislation. It's legislative. So I would say, for companies out there, follow what we've done at Grace Kennedy and at Mayberry. We have to take a lead and, a top-down, decision to implement, do the relevant assessments, partner with the relevant stakeholders where possible, and just have it done and done on time.
So what I want us to consider, because we're what we call data subjects, it is our data that this is all about. We need to look and see what do we want for ourselves. How do we want our data to be treated? Do we want to be receiving text messages about things that we have no interest in? When we think about it from your perspective and then step back and say, okay, well, what do I have to put in place to ensure I can protect the data in the same way that I want my data to be treated? So it really is all about the data subject, and we all here are data subjects. So anything we're doing really inures to our benefit.
For me, I think for smaller organizations, they're going to really need to be aware that the startup cost for compliance may be significant. And for the larger organizations, because of other regulations and requirements, they had to have some of these technical things in place before. For the smaller organizations, they didn't have to, and it didn't exist. So they're going to need to spend a significant amount of money, just to put a lot of these technical requirements in place. And that might be jarring initially, but compared to the fines, compared to the fines and the possibility of them shutting down your business completely, I think it's a worthwhile spend.
Well, folks, you heard it here from GK's Omar Bell, Mayberry's Krishna Singh, and the TTEC and Design Privacy teams. They spoke all about the technical controls that you need to implement for compliance with the Data Protection Act. Today and for a limited time, TTEC will be offering a data protection bundle, which will include a vulnerability assessment, a technical risk assessment, encryption assessment, and a penetration test for a very low cost of $5,000 US. Look out for more information on this bundle, or if you'd like to reach out to us, you can do that as well. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.